Okay, I think we're going to get started. Just want to first say hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bailey Library's final Lake Region Forum of 2020. First, an announcement on our 2021 series is going to come in December. We'll make an announcement, and information for the series will be available online at our website, baileylibrary.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, where we post information about our speakers each month. I would also like to let everyone know that the Library Foundation just kicked off the annual appeal fundraising event. Support from the foundation makes these events possible, such as the Lakes Region Forum. And if you'd like to learn more and support the library, then please visit winthroplibrary.org. Tonight's speaker is environmentalist, Maine registered guide, and avid fisherman Steve Brooke of Upstream, a gardener nonprofit working to return river herring to the Cobbossee Watershed. Steve served as project coordinator of the Kennebec Coalition during the decommissioning and removal of the Edwards Dam in Augusta on the Kennebec River. Steve worked for the Maine State Planning Office for 27 years and began work with Upstream after his retirement. He has lived in Farmingdale for over 40 years, and here he is tonight as a volunteer for the group Upstream. And just one moment here, Steve. And we're glad to have Steve Brooke here with us tonight.
Well, good evening. We'll kick this right off here. I want to say hi to all my friends. I see a number of people that I recognize here. And what I'm going to be doing shortly here is opening up a PowerPoint presentation, if we can find it. Where is my PowerPoint? And we are going to go right to the top of this so we can start it off and go into a slideshow from the beginning. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what we really have going on in the watershed that is part of the Kennebec River watershed and the Cobbossee watershed. I'm going to ask you all to hold your questions until we get to the end of the presentation. Upstream's been working on this effort for a little bit over 5 years now, and this is nothing new. As early as 1777, members of the town of Winthrop and East Winthrop today petitioned the courts to open up the watershed to bring sea-run fish back up to help them in their survival in the area. So we're really picking up on something that is generations old, and we want to work in partnership with the members of the watershed to make them aware of why we're doing this, as well as what the benefits are. I think that this is all background information that I hope will help you all move ahead with this. We live in a very special little corner of the world. Our little corner of the world in the northeast of North America has some really unique properties and attractions. Now, I'm sure that every little corner of the world can say the same, but let's really just talk about what we have here in the state of Maine, on the Atlantic Ocean, but in fact, really deep inside a bay on the Atlantic Ocean. Inside the Atlantic shelf that goes to deep water, a couple of miles offshore. It's a pretty special place. All of Maine's watershed lies within this Gulf of Maine. And the Gulf of Maine is very dynamic. You have a whole series of input from deep water coming directly in, and then cold water from the Scotian shelf. Gets sucked up into the Bay of Fundy. And from there, the tides swing it south. There are two gyres here, one that goes around Jeffrey's Ledge and another one that goes around George's Bank. And all of this mixing of water with the Gulf Stream coming in offshore makes the Gulf of Maine a really pretty unique fishery along the edge of changes and changes. We're going to start off taking a look at some of the estuaries in the Gulf of Maine, in particular northern New England. We're going to start I'm gonna have to move this. Let's move this up here so it's out of the images. We're gonna talk about Great Salt Bay in New Hampshire as an example.
Mr. Brooke, do you know that we can't see your shared screen?
I do not know that. Thank you very much. What can you help me here with this? This should be a shared screen. Let me click on this and go to this.
Right.
We'll share that again.
Is anyone else not seeing it? Because I can see it, Steve. I don't know.
Yeah,
All
I see
right.
it.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
can see it.
I can see it.
Very good. We'll continue on. I'm
I
going to
can
go
see it too.
one slide so we can talk about where we're coming from. We're talking about the Gulf of Maine with the currents that come in and the gyres in the Gulf. And we're going to look at 4 specific areas very quickly to talk about some of the unique ecology. And we'll start down here with where I wanted to. Let's go here. That's where we want to go. Well, we want to go one before this. This is just very challenging to control. Great Salt Bay. Great Salt Bay is in past Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the Naval Air Station, but it's an ecological area that gets an enormous amount of tidal input from the Piscataquis River. And what's really most interesting about this is that there are 4 big rivers that feed Great Salt Bay, but if you look back on the landscape, there are no lakes. So although you've got the Bellamy and the Oyster and the Lamprey River and the Exeter River that all come into this bay, the fish that come in here do not have access to the same habitat that we're really looking for when we're talking about river herring. We'll take a look now up at Scarborough Marsh in Maine. Scarborough Marsh is really unique. It's just south of Portland. And again, you have this enormous estuary that comes in past the beaches. And again, you see no big white fresh water for the fish to connect to. If you haven't visited Scarborough Marsh, I really urge you to do it. Maine Audubon owns a site along in here where you can rent canoes and paddle in some of the meanders into the salt marsh. But the other thing that's really interesting is there's a trail that goes on an abandoned railroad line all the way across, so that you have a chance to get out and have a sense of what the marsh feels like and what it smells like. And you can look down and you can watch the sturgeon that are mostly Kennebec sturgeon leaping, because this is one of the main areas that they go to feed in the summer. All right, let's move a little bit further east now. Let's go down to the New Brunswick border. Let's talk very briefly about Cobbossee Bay, because Cobbossee is really the largest bay in the Gulf of Maine. It runs right along the Canadian border. This would be Eastport and Lubec down here. But a lot of Canadian lands are out and adjacent here. And the river that comes into this one is called the St. Croix River. And the lakes and ponds are miles up the river here. And at this point, the access for sea-run fish is blocked by a number of dams. Some of them have fish passages and they're trying to open up the rest of them. I think that in the future, you're going to see runs of river herring that surpass all rivers in the state of Maine in the St. Croix, because this really has the finest habitat for sea-run fish in the Gulf of Maine. So we'll go back now and we'll come back closer to home. And we'll start to look at Merrymeeting Bay, the Kennebec and the Androscoggin rivers, and talk a little bit about why they are so special. If you look at Merrymeeting Bay here, you have the Androscoggin River draining past Brunswick and in. And from this side, coming down from the north, is the Kennebec. And all of this is always in the way. I can't help it. It's going to be in the way no matter where we go. But you have Swan Island and Richmond. Merrymeeting Bay is half fresh, half salt water. The salt water comes in from the Kennebec system all the way up through this area, comes through the chops, but it stays on the bottom so that the fresh water is already present on the surface of the bay. And that's one of the things that makes Merrymeeting Bay so unique. There are 7 rivers that come into Merrymeeting Bay, and I won't bother to name them all tonight, but I really want to point out one of the things that's really unique about the Kennebec, where it comes into the ocean. As you come down the river past Bath, you have another connection that comes back and starts to feed into this enormous archipelago of islands. I've never seen it referred to as an archipelago, but it really is, with Georgetown and Southport. All of these have a significant amount of salt bays and salt estuaries, so that the fish, the migratory fish, and in particular the juveniles that are coming down the Kennebec, really this time of the year right now, many of them get swept up into the back river, and they get swept down almost all the way over into the Booth Bay Harbor area. And these are all areas where juvenile fish have a chance to grow. And I think that this is one of the reasons that we still have all of these fish in the Kennebec River after all the years that we've had dams in this river system. So let's move upstream a little bit and take a look at what's next. Because again, the Kennebec River and that archipelago of islands with habitat, the Androscoggin, Swan Island. This is about, up in this area is where the saltwater wedge ends. But you still have fresh water on all the surface of this. The Kennebec continues up, and this is Gardner. And this is the Cobbossee Watershed. And this is where Cobbossee County joins the Kennebec. Cobbossee Watershed is a unique estuary, a unique watershed in the state of Maine, primarily because it has such a large volume of lakes and ponds. There are 20.3 square miles of lakes and ponds. And this is the habitat that a number of the sea-run fish really need to survive and to procreate. We zoom in a little bit closer and we'll look at Cobbossee Stream, where it comes down through downtown Gardner. And again, it connects all the way up through the Tacoma chain, all the way up to the Cobbossee Lake itself, and Abessacook, Maranacook, and it just goes on and on. This is over in Monmouth. This is a unique and very special watershed. I think that it's important to think of Gardner as a major contributor to the Industrial Revolution. Ever since 1771, there have been dams along Cobbossee Stream. And in fact, some of the earliest dams here were put in place by the Gardner family. Gardner, rather than developing the land, decided he was going to own and lease dam sites to dam owners. So you had power that was created for mechanical purposes early on. Mechanical power up as much as 2,000 horsepower contributed to all of the mills on this small stretch of river. At this site, which is where the first dam is, this is where the Gardner Paperboard Dam is, this was the site of the first paper mill in the state of Maine. A little bit upstream, there's an old breech dam that was number 6 before the American Tissue Dam. This is now a small hydroelectric contributor. It's owned by a Canadian private entity. Up a little bit further is the very important dam, the New Mills Dam, that impounds the stream, that helps Pleasant Pond get bigger. It controls an enormous amount of valuable real estate. And so in order to be able to bring fish back up into this watershed, we have to talk about getting fish past a number of these dams over time. It's not something that's going to happen immediately, but it's going to happen eventually, I'm convinced. Now, when these dams are still in the stream without fish passage, as they have been for well over 100 years, literally all of the migratory species that are available here to the stream are blocked from access. And what I think is really important for us all to understand, where did that go?
Oh, can you try sharing that one more time, Steve?
Let's share it again. Host disabled the screen share. Okay.
Now you can do it. Sorry about that, everybody.
Let's see. Here we go. Good. Here we go. We want to go here, and I'm going to share it now. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to move this down because this is a really important statement for us to understand. it goes away again. How does that happen? I don't quite understand. We'll have to share that again. We'll have to go to here and we'll share. And I don't understand. We don't need that. Oh, and that was closed by my host. And so I'm going to ask my host to open up the screen share so I can come back. Excellent. We're going to go here and here. I'm sorry for all of the confusion. This is a lot of technology to muster and to be able to control for you all this evening. I've got to go back down in the screen now to where we were starting to talk about Cobbossee Stream. Start the slideshow from that slide, and it should work. Slideshow from the current slide. There we go. And no, that's not it, because that's got all of the text. We want to do the slideshow from the current slide. Well, I'm sharing you much more than you need to see, because a lot of this is my notes.
Steve, try clicking on the actual slide. Maybe it'll expand it onto the left side.
Okay, let's try that. I don't understand. That's never done that before. I'm going to, and then we're going to go back in, and I'm going to start over again. I apologize, because I've got to get into that slideshow. Let's see. Okay, here we go. And we're going to come here. My apologies. Slide dishes. We'll go from the beginning so we can go through it quickly and get down to where we need to be. Thank you very much for your patience. Good. So we were talking about the dams that currently blocking Cobbossee Stream, and I was pointing out that you're never going to get the fish to come back if we don't find a way to get fish past them. And it's important because these fish are a keystone species. These are a diminutive little fish that really has an outmoded or outproportionate impact on the environment that it lives in. It has a role in maintaining the structural community and the ecological community. And without this keystone species, ecosystems really are dramatically different. And the alewife is really important simply because it has such an impact. And I'm going to talk about that impact. These are fish that go to sea as 4-inch juveniles, and they come back in 3 years, and they literally are there to feed the ecosystem. In the ecosystem, it feeds all of the otters, the mink, all of the population of weasels, raccoons, and what's really most important is when you think about all of the seals that come into the Kennebec. There's a seal that hangs out up on the upper Kennebec at Benton Falls, and it eats fish all day, and it lies in the sun, and it comes back and eats fish all day, and it literally puts on almost doubling its weight just during the summer season when the alewife are there. We talk about the birds of the air that really feed these fish, from bald eagles, loons and kingfishers, diving ducks, cormorant, osprey. Osprey, I think, are really particularly interesting because they compete with the eagle for the fish. The bald eagle will harass an osprey that's carrying a fish like this one is and force him to drop it. The bald eagle in some ways are a little bit lazy, and they'd rather steal somebody's fish than find it themselves. The great blue heron, I think, are also special because these are fish that feed mostly on the out-migrating juvenile fish. You'll see these fish standing along the edge in the Kennebec River, picking up juvenile alewives, great little baby blueback herring, and also some of the baby American shad that are spawned out in the river itself. The other thing that I think is really important is that the role all of these riverine fish, all of the river herring play with the offshore fishery, the fish of the ocean. For years, fishermen have known to come to the mouth of the main river stem to really pick up the juvenile fish that are coming out in the fall. All of these fish come to the mouth of the Kennebec, and they wait for the juvenile fish to come in the fall, because these are the fish that they really rely on to hold them over the cold winter. So whether you're talking about the halibut that used to be very plentiful, that are no longer plentiful, the cod that used to be so plentiful, that are no longer plentiful, the haddock that we still have, and the striped bass that we still have, all of these offshore fish feed on river herring as well as the Atlantic herring. And the Atlantic herring populations are really collapsing in the ocean, which make the river herring even more important if they're going to survive. So this little river herring is one of three cousins, and we're going to get to that in just a moment, that really fit the definition of a keystone species, with a disproportionately large effect on the environment that it inhabits relative to its abundance. And they play a critical role maintaining the ecological structure and health of the community. Let's talk about some of the rivers where these fish have been restored that are really close at home. We all live in the Augusta area. If you go up the river into Vassalboro, you can drive up to the base of Weber Pond. And the Weber Pond fishery began to be restored shortly after the Edwards Dam was removed. At Weber Pond, you have this enormous run now of river herring that come in. And as we scroll up, you'll be able to see a fish passage that takes them up and into Weber Pond. At Weber Pond, when they come up the fish passage, they're held in a big pool. And this big pool goes out and enters the lake. And for 3 days of the week, these fish get free swim access into Weber Pond. For the other 4 days of a week, there's a very significant commercial fishery. And the commercial fishery is owned by the town of Vassalboro. That's something that's granted by the legislature. They lease that right out to commercial alewife harvesters. And the alewife harvesters will harvest all that they can during the days that they're allowed to have this harvest. And I urge all of us in this area to go up to see this facility and to talk to the commercial fishermen. They're there on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. On Friday, Saturday, and Sundays, there's a gentleman that sits on this bucket and he counts every fish that goes into Weber Pond so that the escapement of these fish is known, and it's part of the data set that the Department of Maine Marine Resources really needs to see. So this is one of the fish that come up the Kennebec. Let's talk about some of the other migratory fish that we have in the Kennebec River, because I think that this is an important part of the story. It's important because all of these species have co-evolved together. So this is a quiz. I guess I'd ask our host to allow people to be able to respond here, because I'd like to know who recognizes this. What kind of a creature is this in our Kennebec River? Anybody recognize the Atlantic sturgeon? This is a fish that grows in the Kennebec to 6 or 8 feet in length. They're really long-lived. It takes them 15 years to come to maturity sexually. And from there, they'll continue to grow very slowly for the rest of their lives, which can be up to 75 to 100 years. In the Kennebec, Atlantic sturgeon have a little cousin, little short sturgeon that'll grow to 4 feet. That's called the short-nosed sturgeon. The short-nosed sturgeon never leave the Kennebec's lower estuary. The Atlantic sturgeon go out and they wander up and down all along the Atlantic coast, from Cape Cod all the way up into Canada. And I'm sure that a lot of people here have seen the Atlantic sturgeon now that leap in the river, in the Augusta down to the Gardner area. They're really plentiful. When you're paddling on the river, you really want to pay attention because you don't want one of these critters to land in your boat. They're really extraordinary fish. Okay, second fish for a quiz. Who recognizes this one? Anybody? Any show of hands? This is an Atlantic salmon. This is a bright silver Atlantic salmon, which means that he's fresh from the sea. And this fish is trying to get up to his spawning habitat up in the Sandy River and the Sandy River tributaries, right as far as the height of land where the Appalachian Trail goes up the Sandy River. These fish spawn in very cold, very clear water. The adults drop out over the next year. So these fish come into the river in the spring and in the fall. Some of them drop out and some of them overwinter. So they're really in the river all the time. What's really important to remember is that the Atlantic salmon are really on the endangered species list now. And it would be against the law to harvest or to take them or to harass them in any way. I cheated. This is actually from a Canadian river, and I needed a fish to stand in to show you the type of fish that come into the Kennebec. Probably a lot of you recognize this one. This is a brook trout. Brook trouts are primarily river and lake and pond dwellers. On the Kennebec River system, they really look a little different. This is what's called a salter brookie. Salters are really an interesting part of brook trout's real survival strategy. When the water temperatures in the main stem rivers get really warm, or in the little tributary streams where they live, these fish will actually drop down into salt water in the estuaries, and they'll feed in the estuaries where it's cooler. They'll come back into the Kennebec to spawn. This is a fish that was actually caught in Cobbossee Stream in Gardner. It's common to find brook trout in Cobbossee Stream. We've actually come in contact with them as we've been working with the high school students and the survey work, and I'll get back to that later. But one of the reasons that I think this fish is there, that's a large enough fish to come in and to spawn. And I think that fish could well have been coming into Cobbossee to spawn when it was caught. Who recognizes this one? Any show of hands, anybody speak up? This is an American eel. This is a fascinating creature. All of the fish we've talked about up until now are anadromous fish. The American eel is a catadromous fish. This is a reverse of the anadromous fish. The anadromous fish are born in freshwater and go to salt. The catadromous fish is born in the ocean, and he comes and spends its entire lifestyle in freshwater in our lakes and ponds. They'll be 15 to 20 years old before they turn bright silver. As adults, they change morphologically, and they migrate out in the middle of the night, right on the bottom of the river. It's rare to see silver eels going out, and so you have to know that they're there. When they get to the mouth of the Kennebec, they head south, they go down the Atlantic coast, and they go down to the Sargasso Sea, which is out in the deep ocean, midway between Bermuda and the Bahamas. Not only the American eels from the East Coast, but the European eels join them there in the Sargasso Sea to spawn. After they spawn, their eggs float to the surface in little connected chains. And those chains are caught in the Gulf Stream. And as the Gulf Stream sweeps them north, they change a little bit and they turn into baby American eels or elvers. These creatures, when they first come in, are literally transparent. This one's a little bit older. This is beginning to develop a little bit brown color. Lots of them hold in the lower estuaries of the Kennebec, and they go into 3 and 4 foot long black eels or brown, dark brown eels. And those dark brown eels all migrate upstream to find lakes and ponds. And it's pretty remarkable how far these creatures will go. One spring I was fishing up at Russell Pond in the middle of Baxter Park. Russell Pond is 1,340 feet above sea level. And I watched a man pull a big American eel out of Russell Pond. You talk about an amazing journey. That eel would eventually turn silver, migrate all the way back down the Penobscot River system and out to the ocean and back to the Sargasso Sea. Nobody really understands the ecological role that American eels play in our lakes and ponds. It's never been formally studied because These creatures are as close to being threatened and endangered as you can be and still be harvested. People really try to protect the silver eels at all costs, but a friend of mine knew that silver eels were being chopped up by hydropower turbines and went out below a hydro dam, took a number of eel samples and sent the tissue to a laboratory in Texas to try to see what did the eel have in its body system spending its whole life in the lakes and ponds. And this is an eel that was up in the Cobbossee Watershed, and it came out with an enormous amount of toxins that would have been consistent with tanneries and biological, real contaminants that are in the watershed. So it looks to me as though American eels are exporting toxins, taking them to be digested down in the Sargasso Sea, because after the adult eels spawn, they die, like most of the creatures that we know. So this is a little bit different. Who recognizes this one? This one is another anadromous creature. It's called the Pacific lamprey. The lamprey has a really unique life cycle. Move this again so we can see down in there. The life cycle starts when the adults come in April and June, and the adults will actually build a big pile of rocks and lay their eggs in that pile of rocks. And as they're building rock piles, and they're some rocks that are literally the size of a baseball and larger, they clear the bottom and create habitat for other fish to spawn in. I mentioned that these fish have co-evolved. And so it's the full suite and the full spectrum of the fish in a river system like the Kennebec that really begins to make it ecologically healthy. Now, these little creatures then, as they hatch out of the eggs, they bury themselves in the sediment of the river for up to 4 years before they emerge as juveniles. And even at that point, they haven't developed teeth. And they don't develop teeth until they've been for another 10 to 12 months in the river. And they develop this series of teeth, and they literally attach themselves to out-migrating fish. And they go out into the ocean and they look for the largest fish that they can attach themselves to. And then they finally drop off and come back and spawn again. The lamprey have unique characteristics. They're very interesting by science. And since we've taken the Edwards Dam out, the lamprey population in the main stem of the Kennebec has really expanded. But these fish are unique from another perspective. They will not go up a tributary unless there are lamprey already there. Lamprey apparently release a pheromone, and these fish can tell that the scent is there. So I would be surprised to see lamprey coming up Cobbossee Stream if they have a chance. I think that it's really important to remember this co-evolution of fish that are in the river, because I think about the mussels that are out in the main stem stream, the rare lamp mussels and all of the other things. They're not able to swim upstream by themselves. But again, when the migratory fish come in, they sense the pheromone and the presence of these migratory fish. They release their spat into the water column, and it hooks onto the gills of the fish. And they travel with the incoming migratory fish upstream and drop off in the headwaters. And for the rest of their life, it's all downstream with the flow of the water. So again, all of these creatures have co-evolved, and it's really important that we think of the full suite of them in order to have a healthy river system. So we're back to our friend, the diminutive alewife, the keystone species. And the alewife is really one of 3 closely related cousins. And I think what's important to take away here is that each of these subspecies, very closely related, have found their own individual niche in the complicated system of the river herring, blueback herring, the Atlantic salmon, and all of the other things. they each use a slightly different part of the ecosystem. So the American shad, these are big fish. You see these caught in Gardner on a regular basis now. When they come in early in the run. They hold in the outflow of Cobbossee Stream for 2 or 3 weeks or until the flow changes in Cobbossee Stream, and then they continue on up to Waterville. American shad will be 3 to 5 pounds, and some of them are even larger now. And what I'm astounded when I look at the number of eggs a female that's a multi-sea winter fish will carry, 200 to 300 eggs. And these eggs are broadcast into the stream of the main stem Kennebec on flat laminar flows. The males come in and milk the area, and within 48 hours, the eggs have hatched, and the little hatchlings go into the shallows and they grow up slowly. And then this time of the year, the juveniles will start migrating down river to all of that estuarine complex in the lower river system where they can grow a little bit larger before they go to sea. The blueback herring are also riverine spawners, but they have a very different strategy. They have adhesive eggs that adhere to rocks. I'm pretty sure we have blueback herring and alewife in the Cobbossee Watershed at this point from the stocking that's been done by Maine Resources for the past 25 years. Although the colors here look very different. In fact, they're very hard to sort out when you're holding them in your hand. What's really different is some of the internal ear detail in their body structure. But blueback herring come in a little bit later. They'll have 60 to 100,000 eggs. They attach their eggs in clusters to the rock, and the flowing water coming over them allows them to hatch. And like the American shad, the juveniles grow to 3 to 4 inches in upstream habitat, and then they go down to Merry Meeting Bay and the lower estuary this time of the year. The alewife are really pond and lake dwellers for their spawning. The adults will come in with the rest of these fish in the spring. They'll go up into the lakes and ponds, the adults will. They'll broadcast 60 for a 1-year fish, maybe up to 100,000 a year for a fish that's been at sea 5 times. That would be an 8-year-old fish. And the adults immediately drop out if they can. Now, there are some percentage of them that die during spawning that just contribute to the biomass of the ecosystem that are preyed upon by other fish. We know that the eels prey upon them on the bottom. But these fish will go to sea and then they'll return at age 3 to spawn again. And again, it's the number of these eggs that's really important. When you think about the number of fish in the river now and the number of fish that exit the river every fall, I think you're really talking about tens of billions of juvenile fish already in this river system that we've had following the Edwards Dam's removal. Now, I've talked a little bit about the life cycle here, and we'll just go through it quickly again. The adults come in and spawn. You have egg incubation and emergence. Spawning adults return to the sea, freshwater rearing. They grow to maturity in 3 to 4 years, and then they come back to spawn. And these are fish that feed the whole ecosystem, so that the number of them that come back every year differs. There are fewer in the year 2 class than the first year class. By the time you get to 5 years old, it's a very small percentage of the entire run. We'll talk about how we figure all of that out. Let's go on and talk about exactly what these alewife do when they go out to sea. Once the alewife are out to sea, most of our alewife migrate here around the Gulf of Maine. They get caught up in the eddies, and they stay mostly north of Cape Cod, the Cape Cod Peninsula. But alewife as a species ranges from northern Florida all the way up into Atlantic Canada. And the thing that is so important to understand here, these are the fish that are the primary forage base for a lot of the offshore fishery. They feed a lot of the other ecosystems, but their populations are in severe decline all the way along the coast. If you take a look at the American shad caught commercially since 1950 up until the mid-1914, and you look at the alewife in brown, you can see how the populations have grown, but they're very, very slow. If we continue this now, we begin to see a little bit of an uptake, but in fact, these populations of fish are literally down 95 to 97% from where they belong in the reality of the world. If you look at just alewife harvests, and you look in the blue line at the value of the harvest, and you look at the number of fish being harvested, you see there's a big difference here, because during this time, the commercial harvesters were only releasing fish for 2 days into the spawning habitat. That changed in 1999, I think it was. And all of a sudden, you have a great increase, a small increase here, but it begins to go up faster here. It's almost something that grows slowly for a while, then it begins to increase. But look at the value of these fish in terms of millions of dollars that they contribute to the commercial fishing industry. These fish that can be harvested, that are harvested for 4 days a week, and for 3 days the harvest is closed so they get to free swim, they have a significant value. As we look across the state of Maine, all of these lakes that create alewife determine the volume of fish that come to the rivers. So if you look at something like the St. Croix watershed, they have a return population that could be as high as almost 23 million fish every spring. Knobscot comes next with about 14 million, give or take. Kennebec has potentially 11, 12 million. These are conservative numbers with the restoration of this fish in this river. Right now, we're running about 3 to 5 million fish returning to the Kennebec since the removal of the Edwards Dam. And that's below the Benton Falls fish lift. So within the Kennebec's drainage, there's one watershed that really has the greatest potential for alewife. It's really the greatest potential small watershed in the entire state of Maine, and it's the Cobbossee Watershed. And it's pretty clear why. It's because Pleasant Pond, Horseshoe Pond, Hutchison Pond, Jamie's Pond, Cobbossee Lake, and Anabassacook Lake have really significant acreage. You're really got over 7,000 acres of habitat in this suite of lakes. And I think that this is the suite of lakes that we should be talking about over the long term to begin to reintroduce alewife into, to build the population from the Kennebec. In their work primarily on Damascotta Lake, they've discovered that for every 35 fish that can enter one of these lakes, that are allowed to access their spawning habitat, the average return is around 250 fish 3 years later. So there's a delay as this occurs, but then the population can build. So that alewife was designed and has evolved to be very prolific, just so it can survive in our lakes and ponds and continue on. So in Cobbossee drainage, Marine Resources has conducted in kind of an experimental stocking on the lowermost pond for over 20 years. This lets the river herring come in as far as the New Mills Dam in West Gardner. And I think that that's one of the reasons that Pleasant Pond and the lower Cobbossee watershed has really developed such a strong bass fishery, because they feed heavily on the juvenile fish. The harvests that are there are governed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. They've got a really very specific series of data sets that they need to figure out and to understand over a number of years before they'll authorize a harvest to control the comings and goings of these fish. They need to know the age, frequency of these fish. Are they 3 years, 5 years, 7 years long? They need to know what the length of these fish are, how healthy they are, what's the ratio of sex, males to females, and the degree of repeat spawning is really estimated based on scale samples that are taken from them. So Upstream, 3 years ago, started partnering with the Gardner Area High School and developed a citizen science program. And it really takes place at this point on Cobbossee Stream down below Gardner paperboard. So this is in the spring, you can see the bottom of the water.
An extended day for your
This is kind of dangerous water for high school kids. So we work with them very closely. Here you see their prime teacher holding on to the student, reaching out with a net to harvest alewife. After they harvest the alewife, they take them up above, they gather the data, and then they release them into the stream. And they determine the length, the weight, the sex, and the scale samples of 50 fish each week during the entire run. This is an extremely popular program at the Gardner Area High School. At least it was until the pandemic arrived and the school had to go to virtual learning during the alewife run. So this last year, we had a group of dedicated volunteers that would gather once a week, protectively dressed to protect themselves from each other, and stepped up to do the alewife harvest and collection. And it was a very successful effort. We were able to use a throw net, and the throw net was really particularly successful. Oh, I don't have that one in here, so we're going to go back. Because with the throw net, we were able to collect brook trout, American eel, blueback herring, and alewife, all below the lowermost dam on Cobbossee Stream. I'd like to close out this presentation and show you a video that the high school class shot a couple of years ago. This was the first year, and we're going to have to load this, and it's going to take just a moment to find YouTube. And it's coming. It's coming. And so I'm going to silence myself, and we're going to listen to this, I hope. Where's the audio?
Okay, I kind of want him.
We're gonna go fishing!
So my name is Sharon Glant. I'm the AP Bio teacher at Gardner Area High School, and we were offered the opportunity to work with the nonprofit Upstream and the Department of Marine Resources in looking at an alewife project in Cobbossee Stream. So of course I said yes. I mean, you know, take your kids outside every Wednesday for an hour and a half on a gorgeous sunny day. Who would say no to that? So it's an opportunity, I think, for kids to really learn about science, the kind of down and dirty nuts and bolts of it, that it doesn't always work perfectly each week, that there are some times that it runs super smooth and the data that you collect is wonderful, and then there's other times where you have outliers or that your process doesn't really work. And that's what science is about, figuring out what works, how to change it, and how to make it so that it's a process that every school could use in the state of Maine.
My job is to catch the fish with a net, staying away from drop-offs, strong currents, and it's important to always wear a life jacket. It was much easier at the beginning of the run, and now to catch some of the net, now we have to use the fly fishing because they're a little fewer in numbers.
Diane and I are in charge of measuring the fish.
So what we do is we pick the fish out of the bucket over there and we put it on this board to measure it. And so we hold the head down at this end.
Yeah, and then we measured at the fork of the tail, so the little V in the tail, the inside, and then we see what centimeter it's on.
And then we pass it off to do mass. In my part of the procedure, after the fish were measured, I would mass it on the electronic scale in grams. And then I would have to take the average of the masses because it would fluctuate a lot because of how active the fish were. And after that, I would hand it off to be sexed by Oliver or Seth.
I found the sex of the fish, and the way I did it was you held the fish, and then you squeezed its stomach while rubbing it. And if yellow eggs came out, it was a girl, and if white milk came out, it was a guy.
So one of my jobs was to scale the fish, and basically what I would do is every 3 fish, we had to collect a total of 50. I would take a dull knife and someone would hold out the fish, and I would take the blade of the knife and scale upward. And then I would collect the scales, and I would take out the blue paper in here, and in the middle of the blue paper, place the scales on it. In addition, I would have to put the length, weight, sex of the fish, and then I would put this in the back, and I would collect up to a total of 50.
I was in charge of doing the recording for our citizen science project, and what I did is I basically listened to everyone else doing their jobs, and I recorded the mass, the length, and the sex of each fish, and I also recorded whether or not we took a scale from it, and it just helps us to determine like the average weight and the average length and sex of the fish. So when we catch the fish, we have an aerated tank where they can just go in there and breathe and wait for us to handle them. And then when we're handling them, we make sure that we do it really quickly so they don't die. And we also have extra buckets filled with water in case they do need to go into the water while we're handling them.
So with that, I think we're done the program, and if people have some questions, I'll do my best to address them. And I'm going to let our host coordinate and figure out how we want to do this.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. If anybody would like to ask a question, you can just go ahead and feel free to unmute yourself on the mic.
How far up the stream have the alewives traveled?
At this point, they only travel as far as Gardner Paperboard Dam.
Steve, very interesting presentation, very informative. I appreciate it. I'm sure you're aware of the concerns that CWD has. How do you address those concerns?
These are actually concerns that we have as well. This is our lake too. We have no interest at all in finding any way that we're going to have a hard time bringing fish in and not addressing a lot of these issues. We want very much to work with the Cobbossee Watershed District and answer the questions that they have and address the concerns they have. What's really interesting when you start looking out across the state of Maine, there are literally dozens of lakes now that have had alewives brought back to them. And none of them have had the type of results that Bill is concerned about. That's his job to be concerned. I respect that. He's worked long and hard on water quality in the Cobbossee Watershed District. I'm pretty convinced that with an adaptive management program, working closely with the Maine Department of Marine Resources, we really should be able to introduce small populations a little at a time and prove that they're not, in fact, a problem in the watershed. It seems to me that a good start would be to continuing the work on Pleasant Pond. This work is not going to go easily or quickly when you're talking about getting fish past dams. It's expensive and it's time consuming. I think that even if we had all the money and support that we needed today, it would be 8 or 10 years before you could get fish into Cobbossee Lake. So what we're trying to do is educate people about why these fish are important and ask everybody to work together to address the issues and to develop comfort with all of the parties involved.
So Greg Gilda, I am wondering what the CWD concerns are and how you plan to address them.
Well, the Cobbossee Watershed District is concerned about water quality. That's their primary goal. Cobbossee has always been on the edge of water quality, and they've worked hard to create that balance and maintain that balance. I think the district is concerned that the fish will overwhelm the ecosystem. Now, when you look at water quality in the rest of the lakes around our state, this has not been an overwhelming problem. There's no general trend as to whether alewives have helped or hurt water quality. So it's an unknown. Each watershed is different. Each ecosystem is a little bit different. And I think that the way you address this is you address this by adaptive management and carefully controlling the number of fish that come in, not overwhelming the ecosystem as it goes. Now, in order to do that, that means you have to create a commercial harvest to find that balance. And I expect that Marine Resources will want to work with the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission to enable this to happen.
So I'm speaking as a president of Warmatogis Lake Association, and we have introduced alewife to our pond for 10 years. And we have finally got a fish passage the last year. And we have not seen any change in that. And if you look at the water quality indexes, it's anecdotal data, but the last year we have not had any bloom, and we've looked at a significant amount of water quality checks, and this is really a very interesting thing to talk about. But we have been very pleased with what has gone on so far over the past 10 years. We've introduced them.
Thank you for your comment.
Are you pleased because you think the alewives are taking the toxins out into the ocean?
I will answer that, and I will tell you there is anecdotal data, no way to tell us that that is in fact the case. When I look back at that for maybe a decade ago, the thought was that the alewife would take away the plankton. But that's not been proven with any scientific evidence. However, the fishing's great, and so far it's been good, and we've not seen any degradation in the water quality. Let me just put it that way.
I know this is a topic that a lot of people have opinions on. I just want to know if we can keep the questions to the presentation, more so for Steve's presentation, if there are any questions on that.
Did you volunteers get more fish above the dam than the teenagers?
No, that's not something that we do. You have to have a license to do that type of work. Fish that were put above the Gardner Paperboard Dam could not get any further upstream than the American Tissue Dam. And more likely, they just dropped out when they couldn't get to the spawning habitat that they needed. So no, upstream would never engage in an illegal activity and introduce fish where you don't have a permit.
So can I ask a question about how many dams are there? There are 3 dams on Cobbossee going into on the Cobbossee stream, and after that, there are dams on controlling water levels on the other lakes too. Is that correct?
Yes, Jill, that's correct. There's also a dam in West Gardner called the West Gardner Dam. You have the outlet dam at Cobbossee. You have an outlet dam at Anabascook exit. There's an outlet dam for the Tacoma Lake chain. Once fish get above the dam in West Gardner, it would be free swim up into Hutchison and Jamie's Pond, which are old watershed ponds that the Cobbossee, that the Hollowell Water District owns and controls. But again, so I guess if you count from the base of Cobbossee Stream going up, you have a privately held dam, you have a privately held dam at American Tissue that is operating under a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission license. Their new license requires them to build fish passage when the fish get to the base of their dam. You have the New Mills Dam that holds back Pleasant Pond. You then have the dam in West Gardner. It's an old mechanical dam. So it's a loose rock dam. It doesn't always look as stable as it wants to be. At that point, Hutchison and Jamie's Pond would have access before you get to the dam that's at the outlet of Cobbossee Lake. From Cobbossee Lake, they could go into Little Cobbossee as well as Big Cobbossee. And then again, you have another dam before it goes into Anabascook. So there are a number of structures that we can control these fish at, taking it a little bit at a time with an adaptive management program over many years to make sure that water quality of the lake is not being damaged.
I have a follow-up. Do you have to control, I mean, they have to have a fish passage or a ladder or something to get in, but what about getting out in the fall? Does water, I mean, can they go over no matter what the level is?
Generally, fish will go out over the crest of the dam with the flow of water in the fall. The American Tissue Dam has a big drop. And this last summer, they added what's called a plunge pool that will be at their spot where they spill water for the fish going downstream. I think the rest of these dams would probably be able to do without that type of thing as long as the fish have a deep pool to fall into. So you have fish exiting in the spring, which would be the adults leaving. Then you have fish exiting in the fall, which is at the same time that all the lakes are drawn down. The engineers that are working with upstream tell us that water volume is not an issue. There's more than enough water to allow the fish to escape when they need to.
And there's just the one dam that actually produces power?
That's correct. The American Tissue Dam is owned by a private corporation in Canada, a private individual actually, and they have a brand new FERC license, and that FERC license controls the fish passage that they have to build and when they have to do it, or they lose their license.
So the water levels on the other dams are controlled just based on rainfall and recreation and other fish. Are there other fish to consider?
I believe that that's a better question put to the Cobbossee Watershed District.
Okay.
They do manage all the lake levels in this chain of lakes.
Uh-huh. Okay. Thank you.
Steve, a question was sent to me in the chat asking how to get involved in helping upstream.
Well, I suggest you ask to be added to the upstream mailing list. We have a Facebook page that's our primary outreach vehicle. We publish regular newsletters about happenings along the stream. I'm sure that you can reach out just through Facebook is probably the best way to join upstream.
I got a question. I have a question for Steve.
Oh, yep.
Right here. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Bill.
Steve, number one, it was an excellent presentation as always. Very informative, very educational. One of the things that I noticed in the advertisement for the presentation was that an explanation of the keystone status of the alewife. And it mentioned, I don't know, you mentioned Cobbossee Watershed, the streams, the river, and the ocean, I guess. And I was sort of curious as to how you viewed the alewife as a keystone species just within, let's say, the Cobbossee Watershed, in the lakes itself, and not Mary Meeting Bay and not the ocean. But in your presentation, I noticed that you stressed the value of the alewife and its relationship with maybe Cobbossee Watershed and the ocean and the river, and talking about seals in the Kennebec River, birds and ospreys, offshore fishery, halibut, cod, haddock, and being able to maybe augment the collapse of the Atlantic herring population. But I guess as a keystone species in our lakes, not for the food that it provides in the ocean, but also what benefits would Cobbossee and Annabessacook or Pleasant Pond derive by having the alewife returned? And as you know, our concern is primarily water quality. So I guess that's where I'd like you to maybe angle your response.
I think if you're talking about a keystone species, you have to really look at their entire range and the impact they have. I think in the lakes and ponds, let's take, for example, Weber Pond. The bass fishery has grown phenomenally. When you standing there watching the adult alewife coming in to spawn, you can stand and watch enormous bass waiting to eat them. I think that you can look at the land along the stream going into Weber Pond. I've personally watched mink running around in trees, not on the ground, but in trees, climbing up the tree, looking out over the stream, trying to see where the fish are, running back down, and then going to find the fish in the river. We talk about all of the creatures that live on the land. We talk about all of the creatures that live in the air that are part of this will all benefit from the fact that we have alewife. And I think that the other thing that we fail to really give adequate credence to is the amount of people that use alewife. Alewife were exported from the Kennebec system many years ago by the barrel to the south to feed peoples. Right now, the Canadian government collects all the alewife that they can find. They pressure can them, and they use them for food aid across the Caribbean. They actually help support the alewife harvesters that are in Weber Pond and at Benton Falls. So I think that you have to look more broadly across the world and think about what alewife would do to the ecosystem. We have osprey that live on Cobbossee. We have bald eagles that visit all the time. We have kingfishers that feed on them. We have a great blue heron that come in that feed on them. It makes the ecosystem deeper and more complete. And I can tell you just in the time that I've spent working on the Kennebec and some of the Kennebec ecosystem, watching that river come alive with the fish, and it's driven primarily by the river herring. There's just a depth in the ecological life that is present when these fish are present. I would hope the same would be true for some of the Cobbossee lakes.
Yeah.
Old Pleasant Pond has a very strong fishery right now. And I think that is very much being contributed to by the alewife that Marine Resources is already using as an experimental stocking there. So I'm not sure that you need to have an enormous volume of these fish to have it contribute to the quality of life of the people that live around these bodies of water as well.
Well, you know, a keystone species doesn't always have to be beneficial to everyone. It can be beneficial to one aspect of the ecosystem. And in the Pacific Northwest, the Pacific salmon is considered a keystone because of the nutrients that it provides to then generate for a stronger ecosystem or environment for nurturing their juveniles and other animals. And in freshwater, the alewife is considered, in temperate lakes, considered a keystone species for its impact on consuming and preying upon the zooplankton, therefore allowing for greater algae growth. And that is, you know, that's not a good thing for the zooplankton. It's a wonderful thing for the algae. Sharks are also are also keystone species. Not everyone would agree that sharks are wonderful. It's I'm just saying is that promoting alewives as a keystone species, it depends on what perspective you're looking at it from. And I think from a water quality standpoint, the impact that alewives have in freshwater environments, from a water clarity, water quality standpoint, from our perspective, may not be a positive. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I understand your concern. And I've said to you many times before, right from the first time we sat down together in Gardner at lunch or for a cup of coffee, we want to work with you on this. We don't want to impact water quality in Cobbossee Lake negatively either. And from what we've learned so far and what we've observed in other watersheds, we don't think it needs to. I think it can benefit the system. And I think that we need to be able to work together with an adaptive management program that will protect the water quality of this lake if in fact they're introduced at some future time.
All right. And, are there any more questions for Steve? All right. Well, Steve, I want to thank you so much for being here tonight with us for the Lakes Region Forum, and I want to thank everyone as well. Just to let everybody know, like we said, we are going to make an announcement next month about next year's series. So keep checking the Facebook page for that and our website as well. And again, I want to thank Steve Brooke for being here tonight with us with a great presentation. And thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you all.